The moment Edgar Crawford's foreman, Hank Delaney, rode back through the iron gates of the Double C Ranch with his hat still on his head and his horse walking slow, Edgar knew something had gone wrong. A man returning from a completed task rode differently. He rode with the ease of finished business. But Hank rode like a man carrying something heavier than a saddle, something invisible and crushing, and when he swung down off his roan mare and stood in the dust of the yard, he would not meet Edgar's eyes. Well, Edgar's voice came out harder than he intended, cracking across the midday heat like a rifle shot. He stood on the wide porch of the main house, arms crossed over his chest, every line of his body rigid with the kind of tension that came from a man who had spent weeks building a wall around a decision he already regretted. Hank pulled his hat from his head and turned it slowly in his hands. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, not given to sentiment or hesitation. He had worked the Double C for 11 years, had managed 300 head through a drought that would have broken lesser men, had stared down rustlers and negotiated with railroad men, and never once come back from a task undone. "I could not do it," Hank said. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through everything Edgar had constructed. The arrangement, the logic, the cold, necessary cruelty of it. "You could not do what exactly?" Edgar said, though he knew precisely what Hank could not do. "I could not turn her away." Hank finally looked up, and there was something in his weathered face that Edgar had never seen there before, something that looked dangerously close to shame, not his own shame, shame on Edgar's behalf. She was standing at the gate of her father's old property with 2 trunks and a traveling bag and a letter of deed that's as legal as the day is long, Edgar. She has every right to be there. And she looked at me with those eyes, and he stopped. He pressed his lips together. "I could not do it." Edgar said nothing for a long moment. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the fence line, and somewhere in the distance one of the hands was calling out to another, and the ordinary sounds of the ranch went on as if nothing had shifted, as if the world had not just tilted slightly on its axis. "Where is she now?" Edgar asked. "I left her at the old Keene place," Hank said. "I told her you'd be sending someone to speak with her, someone with more authority." He paused. "I didn't tell her who owned the grazing rights to her south pasture." "No," Edgar said quietly. "I suppose you wouldn't." He stood there on that porch for another full minute, looking out at the land that stretched away from him in every direction, golden and vast, and complicated in ways that only he fully understood. Then he turned and went inside, and Hank stood in the yard alone, still turning his hat in his hands, and somewhere 2 miles to the east, Myrtle Keene was unpacking her trunks in a house that smelled of old wood and absence, not knowing that the most powerful man in Calder County had already tried to remove her from the one place on earth she had come home to find. It had started, as so many things in the wild country of southeastern Colorado did in the autumn of 1882, with a piece of paper. Specifically, it had started with the death notice of Thomas Keene, which Edgar had read in the Pueblo Chieftain on a Tuesday morning in September, and which had set off a chain of calculations in his mind that he was not proud of, but that he could not deny. Thomas Keene had owned 480 acres of bottomland along Willow Creek, land that bordered the Double C on its eastern edge, land that Edgar had wanted for a decade, land that controlled the water access for his entire summer grazing operation. Thomas Keene, stubborn and proud and sentimental about the family homestead to a degree that had infuriated Edgar for years, had refused every offer. And now Thomas Keene was dead, and he had a daughter in St. Louis, and Edgar had made certain inquiries about that daughter. What he learned was this: Myrtle Keene was 25 years old, recently widowed herself after less than a year of marriage to a man named George Finch, who had died of typhoid fever before the ink was properly dry on their marriage certificate. She had no income. She had no family in St. Louis besides a distant aunt who had made it quietly clear that a young widow of modest means was a burden the aunt could not carry indefinitely. She had, as far as Edgar's inquiries could determine, nothing in the world except the property her father had left her in his will, and whatever she could make of it. Edgar's original plan had been simple. He would wait for her to arrive, struggle for a season with the isolation and the work of managing a deteriorating homestead alone, and then make her an offer she could not refuse. He would pay fair market value, perhaps a shade above it, and she would sell, and the matter would be settled. He was, in his own estimation, behaving reasonably. He was not trying to cheat anyone. He was simply being practical. What he had not counted on was that Myrtle Keene would arrive 3 weeks earlier than expected, in the first week of October rather than the last, while the weather was still fine and the land was still beautiful, before the isolation and the silence and the hard work had a chance to wear her down. And he had not counted on the letter she had sent ahead of her arrival, a letter to Hank Delaney, of all people, because somehow she had known that Hank had been her father's friend, a letter so warmly and clearly written that Hank had read it twice at the breakfast table, and then folded it with unusual care and put it in his shirt pocket. Edgar had not seen that letter. He had only seen the danger of the situation. He had seen Myrtle Keene arriving with energy and intention before he was ready to make his move, before the land had had a chance to defeat her, and he had made the decision to send Hank to the property with a message. A firm, clear, legally framed message about the grazing rights dispute he had been quietly cultivating as leverage. He had instructed Hank to make it plain to Miss Keene that her arrival was premature, that there were legal complications with the property, and that it would be in her best interest to return to Pueblo and speak with a lawyer before attempting to take up residence. It was not, strictly speaking, entirely false. There was a grazing rights dispute, though Edgar had manufactured most of it through a creative reading of a boundary survey from 1874. But it was manipulative in the way that men with power over land often were, and Hank Delaney, who had spent 11 years watching Edgar Crawford be fair and occasionally ruthless and mostly good, had ridden to the old Keene place with a heavy conscience and arrived to find something that changed everything. He found Myrtle Keene standing in the doorway of the old farmhouse in a traveling dress of dark blue wool, with her dark hair pinned up under a practical hat, and her chin raised at exactly the angle her father used to raise his chin when he was not going to be moved by anything short of an act of God. She was not crying, which Hank had half expected. She was not frail or uncertain, which he had perhaps more than half expected, because he had been living on a ranch full of men for 11 years and had perhaps forgotten what a capable woman looked like when she was standing on ground she intended to keep. She was looking out at the creek bottom with an expression that was not happiness exactly, but something close to recognition, the look of a person arriving somewhere they have always carried inside them, and when she turned and saw Hank Delaney, she smiled at him with such immediate warmth that the words Edgar had given him simply fell out of his head like stones falling from a broken wall. "You must be Hank," she said. "My father wrote about you often. He said you were the most decent man in 3 counties, and I believe he meant it as the highest compliment he could give." Hank had stood there with his prepared speech turning to dust in his mouth and had simply said, "Miss Keene, welcome home." And that had been that. He could not do it. He had ridden back to the Double C and delivered his failure to Edgar Crawford, and now everything was different, and nobody yet knew by how much. Edgar did not go to the Keene property that afternoon, or that evening, or the following morning. He was not a man who moved hastily when he was uncertain, and for the first time in a considerable while, he was genuinely uncertain. He sat in his study that evening with a glass of whiskey he barely touched, and a map of the county spread across his desk, tracing the boundary lines with one finger as if the geography might tell him something the papers could not. The Double C was his life's work. He had come to Colorado Territory in 1871, at the age of 22, with enough money from his family in Virginia to buy the seed of something and the stubbornness to grow it into everything else. He had built the ranch through a decade of hard winters and dry summers and the grinding, unglamorous labor of a man who refuses to be beaten. He was 33 years old now, and the ranch was 3,000 acres, and he employed 14 hands, and he was by any external measure a success. But he had built all of it by himself, which meant he had built all of it alone, which were two things that looked the same from a distance and felt very different up close. His mother had died in 1878, and his father had never come west, and the woman he had thought he might marry in 1876 had taken one winter at altitude and gone back to Virginia with an apology and an engagement ring that he had never asked for back. He was not a man who dwelt on loneliness, because dwelling on it did not change it, but it was there in the house, in the evenings, in the particular silence of a large structure full of expensive furniture and no warmth. He thought about all of this less than he usually did that evening, because he was thinking instead about Hank Delaney coming back and saying those words with that expression on his face, and about what it meant that his most reliable man, the man who had never once failed to complete a task in 11 years, had ridden to the Keene property and come back empty-handed and not even seemed to regret it. He thought about the name, Myrtle Keene. He had spoken it to himself in the context of a property dispute for weeks, and now something about it felt different, though he could not have said precisely why. The next morning he saddled his own horse, a gray gelding named Atlas who was steady and smooth-gaited and trustworthy in the way that Edgar appreciated most in any creature, and he rode east toward the creek. He found her in the kitchen garden, which had been badly neglected since her father's health had begun to decline the previous winter. She was on her knees in the dirt with a small spade in her hand, turning over soil with the focused energy of someone who knew what they were doing, and was not performing the work for anyone's benefit but the garden's. She had pinned her skirts up to keep them out of the dirt, and she wore no hat, and the morning sun was in her dark hair. And she looked so thoroughly at home in the earth of that kitchen garden that Edgar felt something in his chest do something it had not done in a long time, something inconvenient and precise, like a key turning in a lock he had forgotten was there. He dismounted and tied Atlas to the fence post and walked toward her, and she heard him before she saw him, and looked up with her brow furrowed against the sun, a smear of dark soil on her right cheek. And she looked at him without recognizing him, and without any trace of the wariness that his presence usually inspired in people who knew his name. "Good morning," she said, in a voice that was clear and direct and had a slight huskiness to it, as if she had been singing to herself before he arrived, which in fact she had been. "Good morning," he said. "Miss Keene, I expect." "That's right." She sat back on her heels and looked at him steadily. "And you would be." "Edgar Crawford," he said, and waited for the recognition, the shift in expression, the recalibration that his name usually caused in people in this county. She gave him the recognition, because of course she knew the name. Her eyes sharpened and something moved through her face, quick and controlled, and she rose from her knees in a single smooth movement that was more graceful than a woman who had just been in the dirt had any right to be. And she looked at him steadily in a way that made Edgar feel, for the first time in a very long time, that he was being genuinely seen. "Edgar Crawford," she said carefully, as if she were weighing each syllable. "I heard your man was here yesterday." "He was. He didn't stay long." "No," Edgar said, "he did not." "He seemed kind," she said. "I made him a cup of coffee. He looked like he needed one." She paused. "I got the impression he had something to say that he thought better of." Edgar was quiet for a moment, and in that moment he made a decision that was not the decision he had ridden here intending to make, but that felt, suddenly and inexplicably, like the only honest one available to him. He said, "He did. I sent him here to tell you there was a legal complication with the property, and to suggest you return to Pueblo until it could be resolved." The directness of this surprised her. He could see it in the slight widening of her eyes. She had expected maneuvering, and she had gotten a confession, and she did not quite know what to do with it. "And is there," she asked, "a legal complication?" "There is a grazing rights matter that pertains to the south pasture," he said. It is real, though I have perhaps been more aggressive about it than strict necessity requires." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with those steady eyes, and then she said something he did not expect. "Hank Delaney was my father's friend for 15 years. Did you know that? I knew they were acquainted. My father wrote to me about him in every letter, about his fairness, about his character." She looked out at the creek for a moment, and when she looked back at him, there was something in her expression that was not quite forgiveness and not quite accusation, but somewhere between them, something that felt like clarity. "When a man like that cannot bring himself to carry your message, Mr. Crawford, that tells me something about the message." Edgar had been told things about himself before, some of them true and some of them exaggerated, but he had rarely been told something this specifically accurate, and he found he had no good response to it. He said nothing. "What do you actually want?" she asked. "Not what your lawyers want, not what your grazing rights want. What do you want?" "The land," he said, because he was already committed to honesty now and could not find the exit. "I want to buy the property. I have wanted it for years. It controls the water access to my east pasture, and without it my summer grazing operation is always at risk." She nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "And you thought that if you complicated my arrival, made it seem precarious and legally uncertain, I would be more willing to sell." "Yes." "That," she said carefully, "is a deeply dishonest approach for a man who appears to be reasonably intelligent." And then, impossibly, she almost smiled, and Edgar Crawford, who had not been caught off guard by anyone in years, felt something in his chest do that thing again. She did not sell. That was the first thing that became clear over the following 2 weeks, as October deepened, and the cottonwoods turned gold along Willow Creek and the mountains to the west went white at their peaks. She did not sell, and she did not retreat, and she did not in any way behave like a woman who had been defeated by the land or the loneliness before he could bring his offer to bear. What she did instead was repair the fences. She hired 2 men from town, brothers named Louis and Andres Vega, who knew the land and were honest workers, and she set them to repairing the fences and clearing the irrigation channel that ran from the creek to the kitchen garden. And she was often out there working, alongside them in a practical dark skirt and a canvas work jacket, her hair in a braid down her back, moving with a kind of cheerful determination that was completely inconvenient for Edgar's plans and completely impossible to look away from. He found himself riding by the property more often than he needed to. Atlas seemed to develop an opinion about this, occasionally slowing without being asked when they approached the fence line of the Keene property, and Edgar told himself he was monitoring the situation and knew this was not entirely true. On the 15th of October, a cold, bright day with a sharp wind coming off the mountains, he stopped at the property, and she invited him in for coffee, and he sat at the old kitchen table where her father had sat for 30 years and drank coffee that was strong and good, and they had a conversation that began as a negotiation and became something else entirely without either of them planning it. She told him about St. Louis, about the 6 years she had spent there following an education at a women's academy that her father had saved for specifically, because he believed, unusually for a man of his generation and his circumstances, that his daughter deserved to know more than any one piece of land could teach her. She told him about George Finch, briefly and without excessive emotion, the way a person speaks about something painful that they have already processed to the point of peace, and he understood from the way she spoke that she had loved George Finch in the gentle way of a young person who does not yet know what love can do at its full depth, and that the grief she had carried was real but not bottomless. "Why did you come back?" he asked. "You could have sold the property and had enough to establish yourself in the city. You had options." She looked at him across the kitchen table with her coffee cup between her hands and said, "Because when I was in St. Louis, I dreamed about the creek. Not about the city, not about anything I had built there. I dreamed about the sound of the water at night and the way the light comes through the cottonwood leaves in the morning, and I knew what that meant." He was quiet, looking at her. She had a quality of stillness that he had not encountered often, the kind of stillness that is not emptiness but the opposite of emptiness, the kind that comes from a person being entirely present in the moment they are in. "What does it mean?" he asked. "It means this is where I belong," she said simply, "and I have learned not to argue with that kind of knowledge." He rode home that evening with the conversation moving through him in a way that was unfamiliar and not entirely comfortable. He had come to this county to build something, and he had built it, and it had been enough for a decade, and had recently begun to feel like it was not enough, and he had not, until now, been able to identify precisely what was missing. But sitting at that kitchen table drinking strong coffee and listening to a woman talk about dreaming of a creek, he had begun to feel the shape of the absence. He told himself this was irrelevant. He had a plan. She was an obstacle to the plan. He needed to find a legal, ethical way to resolve the grazing rights matter and either purchase the property or come to an arrangement that protected the Double C's water access. That was the task. The task did not include the feeling he got when she almost smiled at him, and it did not include the way she had looked at him, and said that was a deeply dishonest approach, and somehow made it sound almost like an invitation. Hank Delaney, who had been watching all of this with the patient attention of a man who has lived long enough to recognize a person in trouble with themselves, said to Edgar one morning, while they were mending a section of fence together, "I hear you've been stopping by the Keene property." "I have been attempting to negotiate a resolution to the grazing rights issue," Edgar said Hank, in the way that meant he knew exactly what was happening and was choosing to let Edgar arrive at it on his own. "Don't," Edgar said. "I didn't say anything," Hank said. "You were about to." "I was going to say," Hank said mildly, "that she reminds me of her father, clear-eyed. Not impressed by things that are just meant to impress. Those kinds of people are rare." He drove a staple into the post with 2 precise hammer blows. "Her father was the best neighbor I ever had in all the years I worked this ranch. Honest and fair and never caused a trouble that wasn't forced on him. I hated that the two of them never had more time together after she grew up. He was very proud of her." Edgar worked the wire in silence for a moment. Then he said, "She told me she dreamed about the creek when she was in St. Louis." Hank looked at him sideways. "Did she?" "She said that was how she knew she needed to come back." Hank said nothing, but something in his expression settled into the particular satisfaction of a man who has been proven right about something he never stated explicitly. The grazing rights matter came to a head at the end of October in a way that Edgar had not planned and could not control. A lawyer from Pueblo named Gerald Maston arrived at the Keene property with a formal notice that Edgar had filed weeks earlier, before the conversation at the kitchen table, before the afternoon of strong coffee and honestly about the creek. And Myrtle Keene received this notice with a composure that Edgar, when he heard about it from Luis Vega, found both admirable and alarming. She came to the Double C the following morning. She rode a brown mare that he recognized as one of the horses from her father's barn, and she rode well, which he noticed because he noticed most things about her now, whether he intended to or not. She came to the front gate and asked the hand who met her if Mr. Crawford was available, and when Edgar appeared on the porch she dismounted and walked to the steps with the formal notice in her hand and looked up at him with an expression that was not angry but was absolutely serious. "You filed this before we spoke," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. "You filed it while you were already planning to come to my property and introduce yourself and have coffee." "Yes. And you came anyway, knowing this was already in motion." He stood there on the porch steps, looking at her, and he wanted to defend himself and found he could not assemble a defense that would hold against the clarity of her assessment. He said, "I came because Hank came back and said he could not deliver my original message, and I wanted to assess the situation directly." "And what did your assessment conclude?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment, standing in the morning light with the formal notice in her hand and her chin raised at that angle that was purely her father's, and he said that I had been managing a situation I should have been approaching honestly from the beginning. She was quiet, looking at him. I cannot maintain the property without access to the south pasture water, she said. You know that. I know you know that. If you press this grazing rights claim, you force me off the land without ever having to make me an offer, which is tidier for you legally but is also, she paused, and the pause was precise, a deeply dishonest approach for a man who appears to be reasonably intelligent. She was quoting herself back at him, deliberately, and despite everything he felt something that was dangerously close to a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. Come inside, he said. Let me show you the survey documents. The ones I was using to build the case. I want you to see exactly what I was doing and exactly why it does not hold up to fair scrutiny. She blinked just slightly. This was not what she had expected. She had come prepared for a fight and he was offering her a table to sit at and she was adjusting. She came inside. He spread the survey documents on the dining room table, the one he used for business when he could not be bothered to climb to the study, and he walked her through the creative interpretation he had been applying to the 1874 boundary survey, and she followed it with sharp, quick intelligence, asking two questions that cut directly to the places where his argument was weakest. And by the end of it they were both standing over the table looking at the documents, and she said, "So you had nothing." "I had a creative reading of an ambiguous document," he said, "which in the hands of a sympathetic judge might have gone somewhere, but it would not have been just and it would not have been right, and I think that is why Hank could not carry my first message." He looked at her. "He is a better man than I was being." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the documents, and then she looked up at him, and the directness of it was something he was not prepared for, the way she looked at him as if she were reading something written in a language he did not know she spoke. "What do you actually need?" she asked. "From the south pasture specifically." He told her. He told her about the water access and the timing of the summer grazing rotation, and exactly how the creek flow from the Keene property bottom land fed into the channels his cattle depended on from June through August. He told her with the specificity of a man who had been thinking about this problem for a decade, and had never before had anyone ask him to explain it in full rather than simply respond to an offer. She listened. She asked 3 more questions, the kind of questions that revealed a mind that had been paying attention to how land worked even from the distance of St. Louis. And then she said, "What if we wrote an easement? A formal, legal water access agreement that gives you the right to use the south pasture water channel during the summer rotation, with specific terms about timing and volume, and I retain full ownership of the property and all other uses of the land." He looked at her. He had been operating, for months, on the assumption that the only solution to the water problem was ownership. He had not considered an easement, not because it was a bad idea, but because ownership had been the goal, and he had arranged his thinking around the goal, and had not looked past it to the simpler, more equitable solution that was sitting right there in the middle of the table between them. "That would work," he said slowly. "That would actually solve the problem." "I know," she said, and there was no triumph in it, just the calm certainty of someone who has thought a problem through to its clean solution. He looked at her for a moment, this woman who had come back to a property she dreamed about in St. Louis, and had sat across from the most powerful landowner in the county, and offered him the solution he had been too narrowly focused to find for himself. He said, "Miss Keene, I have been going about this in entirely the wrong direction." "Yes," she said, "but you are going about it correctly now, and that is the more important thing." They drew up the terms of the easement themselves, that afternoon, sitting across the dining room table with paper and ink, and then a week later they had Gerald Maston formalize it into a legal document that both parties signed in the office of the county clerk in Calder on a cold November morning. And that should have been the end of it. That should have been the resolution, the tidy legal conclusion to what had begun as a manipulation and been transformed, through Hank Delaney's inability to complete his mission and Myrtle Keene's calm intelligence, into something equitable and fair. They had resolved the dispute. The business was finished. Edgar had no more reason to ride east toward the creek, except that he kept doing it, not every day, not even every week, but with a frequency that Hank noted with continued silent satisfaction, and that Edgar continued to frame to himself as courtesy, as the reasonable attention one neighbor pays to another, particularly when that neighbor is a woman managing a property alone in the Colorado Territory in the winter of 1882 and 1883, which was a hard winter by any measure. November brought snow in the second week, earlier than usual, a soft, heavy snow that made the world quiet and beautiful and cold, and Edgar found himself riding to the Keene property on a Thursday afternoon, with the ostensible purpose of checking that the water channel was properly closed for winter, which was a thing he could have sent anyone to check, and arriving to find Myrtle chopping firewood in the side yard with a competence that he stood by the fence for a moment and simply watched. Because she had good form and a good rhythm, and was clearly not someone who needed to be rescued from a wood pile. She saw him and set the axe in the chopping block and walked over with her breath clouding in the cold air and her cheeks red from the exertion and said, "Mr. Crawford, is something wrong with the channel?" "No," he said, abandoning the pretense with an ease that was becoming habitual when he was around her. "I came to see how you were managing the cold." She looked at him with that clear gaze, the one that saw through things, and said, "Quite well, thank you. Would you like to come in for coffee?" "I would," he said. He came in for coffee. They sat by the fire she had built in the parlor, which she had rearranged from her father's spare arrangement into something that was still practical but had warmth to it. A woven blanket on the back of the chair, books stacked on the side table, a small watercolor painting of a heron that she had done herself propped on the mantelpiece, and they talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with property lines or water easements. She told him about the books she had been reading, a novel from England that she had strong opinions about, and a natural history of the Colorado Territory that she found both informative and occasionally infuriating in its inaccuracies about bird behavior. He told her about the calving operation and the expansion he was planning for the spring, the new barn he intended to build on the north end of the property, and she asked questions about the construction and the economics of it that were sharper and more interesting than the questions he usually got from anyone when he talked about the ranch. She seemed genuinely interested in how things worked, in the practical, connected logic of a ranch operation, and he found himself talking more freely than he usually did, saying things he thought rather than things he had decided in advance were worth saying. When he left that evening, riding home through the blue winter dark with Atlas moving steadily beneath him, he understood that the situation had become something he had not planned and could not easily rearrange. He was falling in love with her. He recognized it the way a man recognizes a physical landmark in unfamiliar country, with relief and alarm in equal measure, because it tells him where he is, but it also tells him the distance he has already traveled. He had not been in love in a long time and had not expected to find it coming at him out of a grazing rights dispute. But here it was, as clear and cold and certain as the air he was riding through. The question was what to do about it. He was not by nature an impulsive man. He thought before he acted. He measured consequences. He had built the Double C on careful, deliberate decision-making, and he brought this same careful deliberation to the problem of Myrtle Keene and what he was feeling, and what he intended to do with it. He was also aware, with a clarity that was uncomfortable, that he had not begun this situation well. He had tried to manipulate her. He had filed a legal notice designed to pressure her. He had sent his foreman to turn her away before he had ever met her, treating her as an obstacle rather than a person. He had corrected those things, or had begun to. But he was aware that the history of it was there, that she knew it, and that she was not a woman who would forget context. She was too intelligent for that, too clear-eyed, and those were exactly the qualities he most admired about her, and also the ones that made the situation most complicated. He did not do anything dramatic or hasty. He continued to stop by the property when the weather made it sensible to check on a neighbor, and they continued to have their conversations by the fire or at the kitchen table. And the conversations continued to be the most genuinely interesting ones he had in any given week, which said something about the quality of the previous years that he tried not to examine too closely. December came in with a sustained cold that froze the creek by Christmas and turned the world to blue and white, and the particular silence of a landscape entirely covered in snow. On Christmas Eve, which was a Sunday, Edgar rode to the Keene property with a bundle that included a plucked and dressed chicken from the Double C kitchen, which was a practical gift he knew she would not refuse, and a small book of poetry that he had ordered from the bookshop in Pueblo 3 weeks earlier on the theory that a woman who read natural history and debated English novels would appreciate poetry, and that this was a true gift rather than a useful one, and that offering it would reveal something. She opened the door in a dark green wool dress that he had not seen before, and behind her the house smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke, and she looked at the bundle and then at him and then at the bundle again and said, "You did not have to come out in this cold." "I wanted to," he said, which was true and somewhat more revealing than his usual careful sentences. She took the chicken with the practical gratitude he had expected, and the book with a kind of careful attention that was different, turning it in her hands, reading the title, and looking up at him with an expression that was softer than her usual clarity. "Come in," she said. They had dinner together that evening, the chicken that she roasted with herbs from the dried bundles hanging in her kitchen, and bread she had made that morning, and a bottle of wine that he had also brought from the Double C cellar, and they sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight while outside the snow fell again, softly and persistently, covering the world, and they talked about things that moved through Edgar's chest long after he had ridden home. She told him about her mother, who had died when Myrtle was 11, and about how her father had raised her after that, how he had taught her to read the weather and understand the creek and speak to the animals without fear, and how she had carried all of that into the years in St. Louis and back again. He told her about Virginia and the family he had left, about his mother who had been the kind of woman who made a large house feel occupied and warm, and whose absence he still felt in the particular emptiness of the Double C in the evenings. He told her about the spring of 1871, when he had ridden west on a train and then on horseback and found the valley along Willow Creek and understood in his bones that this was where he was going to build his life. "So you dreamed about it too," she said. "In a way." He looked at her across the table. "I suppose I did." She held his gaze for a moment, and the lamplight was between them, warm and steady, and outside the snow fell and the world was covered in quiet, and he said, "Myrtle." The first time he had used her given name, she did not correct him. "I made a poor start with you," he said. "I know that. I want you to know that I know it." "You did," she agreed simply. "I sent Hank to turn you away before I knew anything about you except that you were standing between me and something I wanted." He paused. "I am grateful that he could not do it." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "So am I." The admission hung in the lamplight between them, and he felt it land in the place where things that matter land, deep and precisely placed. He did not push beyond it that evening. He was not a man who pushed at things that were still becoming what they were. He rode home through the snow and the dark with the kind of careful joy that comes from knowing something good is happening without yet knowing its full shape, and that was enough for that night. January was brutal, the coldest January in the region in 8 years according to the men who tracked such things, and Edgar had his hands full with the cattle operation, with frozen pipes and sick animals, and the endless labor of keeping a herd fed through a sustained deep freeze. He sent Hank to the Keene property twice to check the water line and to bring a load of extra firewood from the Double C woodpile, because the firewood was practical and he would have done it for any neighbor, and also because he wanted her to know she was not forgotten in the cold. Both times Hank reported that she was managing well, that the house was warm and the animals were fed, and she was reading by the fire when he arrived, and did not seem to be suffering from the isolation in any way that worried him. The second time, he brought back a message from her, a small folded note that said simply, "Thank you for the firewood. The creek made a sound last night that I had not heard since I was a girl. Tell Mr. Crawford, please." Edgar read the note 3 times and then put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, which was where important things went. In February, the thaw began to suggest itself in the afternoons, the sun carrying a slight warmth again, the snow on the south-facing slopes beginning to retreat. Edgar rode to the Keene property on a Saturday and found Myrtle outside inspecting the kitchen garden, planning the spring planting, making notes on a piece of paper with a pencil she had tucked behind her ear. She turned when she heard Atlas, and her face did something when she saw who it was, something quick and warm, and Edgar felt it in his chest like a bell. They walked the property together that afternoon, the first time they had done so, and she showed him what she had planned for the spring, the extended kitchen garden, the repair to the south fence, the 2 young fruit trees she intended to plant along the east side of the house. She had been corresponding with a nurseryman in Colorado Springs who had varieties suited to the altitude, and she pulled a letter from her pocket and showed him the response with the enthusiasm of someone sharing something genuinely exciting. He watched her show him the letter, watched her hands as she unfolded it and pointed to the passage about the apple variety she had ordered, and he thought that he had never been as interested in fruit trees as he was at this moment, which told him something. She caught him watching her and did not look away. She said, "What is it?" he said. "I have been wondering for some time whether you would consider." And then a sound came from the direction of the creek, a loud crack of ice breaking, and they both turned toward it reflexively, and in the pause that followed the moment had shifted, and Edgar finished the sentence differently than he had intended. "Whether the creek flooding will reach the garden." She looked at him for just a beat too long, as if she knew that was not what he had been about to say, and then she looked at the garden and said, "I have the beds raised enough. It should be fine." He rode home that afternoon having not said the thing he had been about to say, and he sat in his study that evening trying to determine whether this was caution or cowardice, and could not clearly tell them apart. March arrived with mud and the particular chaos of early spring on a working ranch, calving in earnest now, the hands working long shifts, Edgar himself out in the dark and cold more mornings than not, attending to the work that could not wait. He saw less of Myrtle in March, and this absence felt like something with a weight to it, like a stone in his boot, always there when he was moving, always reminding him. In the second week of March, a man arrived in Calder County from Pueblo. His name was Bennett Hale, and he was a land agent, and he had heard through the particular channels that land agents operate through that there was a young widow on a property along Willow Creek who might be interested in selling. He arrived at the Keene property on a Tuesday morning and presented himself and his proposal with considerable charm and a very generous offer in cash. Edgar found out about this visit on Wednesday evening from Luis Vega, who had been repairing the fence along the road when the land agent arrived, and had noted the conversation through the fence, not intentionally eavesdropping but not moving either. He reported it to Edgar because he had been working the Keene property for months and had the loyalty that honest work creates. Something moved through Edgar that was not entirely reasonable or proportionate, but was absolutely real, something that sat at the intersection of fear and jealousy, and the particular alarm of a man who has been taking his time and suddenly understands that time has a cost. He had been careful. He had been measured. He had not pushed, and someone else had ridden in and put a number on the table. He rode to the Keene property on Thursday morning without thinking particularly carefully about what he was going to say, which was unusual for him, and he found her in the kitchen reading a letter, which was the land agent's written follow-up to the Tuesday visit, containing the formal offer. She looked up when he came in because he had stopped knocking weeks ago and she had stopped expecting him to, and she set the letter on the table and looked at him with that clear gaze. "You've heard about Mr. Hale," she said. "Yes," he said. "Lewis," she said, not as a question. "Yes," she nodded. "Mr. Hale made a generous offer," she said. "Very generous, in fact, more than the property is currently worth by any reasonable assessment." Edgar stood in the kitchen doorway, his hat in his hands, and said, "Are you going to take it?" She looked at him steadily. "That depends," she said, "on several things." "On what?" he asked, and the question came out with more urgency than he had intended, which was perhaps what she needed to hear. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Edgar." The first time she had used his given name. "I came back to this property because I dreamed about this creek. I came back because this is where I belong. I am not going to sell it to a land agent from Pueblo." She paused. "Unless I have a reason to." He was looking at her. "A reason to sell. A reason that would change what this property means to me," she said carefully. "A reason that would mean my life here would look different than it does alone." She held his gaze with steady eyes. "Do you understand what I am saying?" He understood precisely what she was saying. He had always been good at understanding precise things. What she was saying was that she needed to know what he was to her before she could know what she was going to do about anything else. And she was offering him the space to say it, clearly and without the diplomatic hedging he usually deployed, without the management of outcomes. She was asking him to be honest in the way that mattered most. He put his hat on the table, which was a thing he had never done in her kitchen before, a small gesture of permanence or intention, and he said, "I want to ask you to stay." "I know you do," she said. "Tell me why." "Because," he said, "I rode past your property in October to see what you were like, and I found you on your knees in the kitchen garden with dirt on your face, and I could not look away. Because every conversation I have had with you in the last 4 months has been the most interesting I have had in years. Because you saw through what I was doing with the grazing rights matter in about 5 minutes, and offered me a better solution than the one I had been planning for 10 years. Because you send me notes about the sound of the creek, and I carry them in my jacket pocket." He stopped. He had more to say, but it required the most careful honesty. "Because I started by treating you badly, by treating you as a problem to be managed. And Hank came back and said he could not do it, and that was the best thing that happened on this ranch in a decade. I am grateful every day that he is a better man than I was being. And I am asking you," he stopped again and started again, "I am asking you, Myrtle, if you would consider building something here. With me. Not your property and my property and a water easement between us. Together." She sat very still while he said all of this, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment, and the kitchen was quiet around them, and the sound of the creek was coming through the window, the late winter creek running high with snowmelt, the creek she had dreamed about in St. Louis. "Together," she said quietly, as if testing the word. "I know that I began this wrong," he said. "I know I don't have the right to ask it easily, but I am asking it honestly, which is the only right I can actually claim." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she picked up the land agent's letter and held it over the flame of the lamp until the corner caught fire, and then she set it in the metal dish on the table that she used for spent matches, and they watched it burn. "Together," she said again, and this time it was not a question. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her hands, and she stood, and he was close enough to see the warmth in her dark eyes and the slight irregularity of her breathing, and he said, "Can I?" And she said yes before he finished the question. He kissed her in the kitchen of the house where she had grown up, by the window that looked out at the creek, with the smell of wood smoke and cinnamon still in the air from Christmas. And she kissed him back with the directness that was absolutely characteristic of her, and that he had been in love with for months without admitting it. When they stepped back from each other, she was looking at him with something in her expression that was new, a kind of settled warmth, like a lamp turned up from its lowest setting. and he was aware that he was probably wearing an expression equally revealing and did not particularly care. "You're going to need to speak with me about this formally," she said, and there was a lightness in her voice that he had not heard before. "I am a woman with property and an attorney in Pueblo, and I require things to be done correctly." "I will speak with you about it formally," he said. "Tomorrow, if you are available." "I believe I can arrange to be available," she said. He stayed for dinner. He came back the next day and was formal and clear, and she listened with a composure that occasionally broke into the almost smile, and then resolved back into composure. And she gave him her answer, which was yes, with conditions that were entirely reasonable and that he agreed to without negotiation because they were fair, and because at this point he would have agreed to considerably more. The conditions were that the Keene property remained in her name, that she retained full authority over its operation, that the water easement agreement remained in force as a separate legal document, unaffected by any change in their personal relationship, that she continue her kitchen garden and her correspondence with the nurseryman in Colorado Springs, and her reading of natural history and English novels, and whatever else she found interesting, without any expectation that managing the Double C's social or domestic demands was her primary obligation. Edgar agreed to all of it, readily and without reservation, because these were not demands born of suspicion, but of the same clear intelligence that had offered him an easement instead of a fight, and he was finding that he increasingly wanted his life to be managed with that quality of thinking in it. They told Hank first. It seemed right, given everything. Hank was in the barn when Edgar and Myrtle rode in together on a Saturday morning, and he looked up from the harness he was mending and saw them and went very still for a moment, reading the situation the way a man who has spent a lifetime watching things reads it. "Well," he said. "We wanted you to know," Myrtle said. She had dismounted and she walked into the barn and held out her hand to Hank, and he took it with the particular gravity of a man doing something that matters. "My father thought very well of you. I trust his judgment entirely." Hank looked at her and then at Edgar, and there was something working in his weathered face that was not quite emotion but was very close to it. He said, "Your father was the best neighbor I ever had, Miss Keene." "Miss Myrtle," he looked at Edgar. "You done right finally." "Finally," Edgar agreed without defensiveness because it was true. "I'm glad," Hank said. "I'm very glad." They were married in May of 1883, on a Saturday when the cottonwoods were in full leaf along Willow Creek, and the apple trees Myrtle had planted in March were putting out their first small leaves, and the light came through the valley in the long golden way of late spring afternoons. The ceremony was small, held in the parlor of the Keene house because Myrtle had wanted it there, and Edgar had understood immediately why. And the guests were Hank Delaney, and the Vega brothers, and Gerald Maston the lawyer, and 3 families from town who had known Thomas Keene, and were glad to see his daughter settled and happy. The minister came from Calder and was a practical man who kept the ceremony short and dignified, and when it was finished and Edgar was permitted to kiss his wife, he did so with a thoroughness that caused Hank to look at the ceiling and Louis Vega to look at the floor and Andres Vega to grin broadly. They did not go away for a wedding trip because the calving season was barely finished and there was work to do, and Myrtle would not have wanted to leave the apple trees in their first growing month in any case. Instead, they spent their first weeks as a married couple living between the 2 properties, moving through the practical, overlapping demands of 2 working operations while beginning to understand the shape of a life together. Edgar had expected the adjustment to be complicated, because any significant change in the structure of one's life requires adjustment, but what he had not expected was how naturally she moved through his world and his through hers. She came to the Double C and sat in on his weekly meetings with the hands with a composure that unsettled the newer men and did not trouble the older ones, and she asked questions about the cattle operation that were specific and practical, and that Edgar found himself including in his own planning. He came to the Keene property and worked beside Lewis and Andres on the fencing and the irrigation, and felt the particular pleasure of work on land that was connected to the land he had built, all of it along the same creek, all of it part of the same watershed and the same valley. In June, Edgar began the negotiations with a neighboring rancher named Prescott about a shared approach to the summer water management. Negotiations that benefited from Myrtle's presence because she had inherited her father's gift for the kind of plain-spoken fairness that moved conversations forward. And Prescott, who had been resistant to previous discussions, came to an agreement within 2 meetings. Edgar told her afterward that she had resolved in 2 afternoons a dispute that he had been circling for 3 years. She said, "You were trying to win the argument. I just wanted to solve the problem." He looked at her across the dinner table, this woman he had spent months approaching from the wrong direction and who had consistently, patiently, and without drama redirected him toward the right one. He said, "You are the most useful person I have ever encountered." She gave him the full smile this time, not the almost smile, and said, "What a romantic thing to say." He laughed. He had laughed more in the 8 months since October than in the previous several years combined, and he was aware of this and grateful for it in the particular way of someone who did not realize something was missing until it arrived. Summer settled over the valley in the fullness of its Colorado heat, and the water easement that they had written together at Edgar's dining room table moved the creek water through the channels as it should, feeding the east pasture cattle through the July and August rotation, and the kitchen garden flourished under Myrtle's management with a productivity that impressed even Luis Vega, who had grown up farming in New Mexico and had high standards for kitchen gardens. The apple trees put on their first significant growth, not yet bearing fruit but clearly intending to, reaching toward the sky with the patient determination of young growing things. Edgar and Myrtle had their first real disagreement in July about the expansion of the cattle herd. Edgar wanted to add 80 head in the fall purchase, and Myrtle's concern was the carrying capacity of the east pasture in a dry year, a worry that was grounded in the kind of detailed observation of the land that she had been conducting since she arrived, and that Edgar had not, until she raised it, thought to incorporate into his planning. The disagreement was direct and not entirely comfortable and lasted 2 evenings and resolved into a compromise, 60 head rather than 80, with a contingency plan for the south pasture of the Keene property as a supplementary grazing area if the summer of 1884 was drier than average. It was, as compromises went, a better outcome than either original position, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it together was a particular satisfaction. Hank Delaney, watching the ranch operate with a quiet efficiency that it had not previously possessed, said to no one in particular one afternoon that some things improved the operation of a ranch in ways that had nothing to do with cattle numbers or fence quality, and left it at that. In September, Myrtle told Edgar that she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen of the Keene house, which they used most mornings because the light was better, and the coffee was better, and the view of the creek was better. And she told him with the directness that was characteristic, and also with a particular quiet that he had learned to pay attention to. He was quiet for a moment too, taking it in, and then he got up from his chair and came around the table and held her very carefully, as if she were something precious, and she laughed at him being careful and said, "Edgar, I'm not made of glass." And he said, "No, I know. I know exactly what you are made of," and kissed her hair, and she leaned against him and they stood by the window with the sound of the creek coming through, the September creek running clear and cold. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was gentler than the previous one, which felt like a small mercy extended by the particular climate of the valley, and Myrtle moved through it with the same practical energy she brought to everything, managing the Keene property through the cold months with Lewis and Andres, and an additional hand Edgar had hired at her request. A young man named Thomas who was 17 and steady, and whom Myrtle was teaching to read in the evenings, because he had not had the opportunity growing up. Edgar watched her teach Thomas to read on 3 separate occasions, pulling a chair up to the kitchen table and going through the letters with the patience of someone who understood that learning is not linear, and who treated the young man's slow progress not as a problem to be solved, but as a journey to be made at its own pace. He watched this and understood that he was living with someone who was not only intelligent and clear-eyed and capable of solving land disputes and managing water easements, but who was kind in the way that mattered most, the way that extended to people who had nothing to offer in return. In January of 1884, a situation arose that tested the peace of the valley in a way that the grazing rights dispute had not. A group of men from a cattle company operating out of Denver arrived in Calder County with a surveyor and a claim to a section of common grazing land along the north end of the valley that several small ranchers in the area depended on. The claim was legally dubious, but the men behind it had money and lawyers and the kind of confidence that comes from having prevailed over smaller operators before. Edgar had encountered this kind of pressure before, had weathered it on his own, and had the resources to fight it if necessary. But what he had not had before was Myrtle, who sat with him through 3 evenings of reviewing the documents and identified the precise weakness in the Denver company's survey claim, which hinged on a boundary marker that had been moved, not by accident, and whose original position was documented in the county records from 1876. She found this because she had a methodical mind, and because she had grown up on a property whose boundaries had been a matter of discussion and occasional dispute for years, and she knew how survey documents worked. Edgar took the information to Gerald Maston, who took it to the county clerk, and the Denver company's claim dissolved within 2 weeks. 3 of the small ranchers who depended on the common grazing land came to the Double C to express their gratitude, and Edgar directed them to speak with Myrtle, which surprised them, and which she managed with a matter-of-fact warmth that sent them home with a positive impression that would prove useful in the years to come. The summer of 1884 was drier than average, which had been Myrtle's concern, and the contingency plan they had built into the November agreement proved necessary in August, when the east pasture fell short, and the south pasture of the Keene property provided the supplementary grazing that kept the herd through the month. Edgar looked at the south pasture feeding his cattle in the August heat and thought about the woman who had stood in her kitchen garden with a spade and offered him an easement instead of a fight, and felt a gratitude that went well beyond the practical. Their son was born in the 2nd week of October, 1884, a strong boy with dark hair and a set of lungs that announced his arrival to everyone within a considerable radius of the Keene house, where Myrtle had chosen to have the birth because of the particular quality of the light in the bedroom and her own attachment to the room. Edgar was present, which was unusual for the time, and which the midwife, a competent woman named Mrs. Hester, accepted with the pragmatic tolerance of someone who had seen men behave much more foolishly in the same circumstances. They named the boy Thomas William Crawford, Thomas for Myrtle's father and William for Edgar's. Thomas William arrived in the world with an opinion already formed about most things, which Edgar recognized as a family trait and Myrtle accepted as entirely reasonable. Hank Delaney, when presented with the infant, held him with the careful uncertainty of a man who rarely held infants, and who was clearly moved by it in a way he was managing with his characteristic dignity, and said that Thomas William looked like he intended to have a strong point of view, and Myrtle said yes, that was the general plan. The fall of 1884 settled around the valley with the particular golden peace of a season following a difficult summer, and the cottonwoods turned along the creek, and the apple trees in Myrtle's side yard put on their first actual fruit, 3 apples on the younger tree and 7 on the older, small and hard and more sweet than they had any right to be given that they were the first. Myrtle brought two of them inside and cut them open at the kitchen table, and they tasted them together, Edgar and Myrtle, with Thomas William asleep in the basket by the fire. And she said they were good, and Edgar said they were excellent, and they were both right. He had the water easement and the property documents filed in the county records in a consolidated form that their attorney recommended, and the Double C and the Keene property, while remaining legally separate, were managed as the interconnected operations they had become. Louis and Andres Vega continued working the Keene property, and Edgar had expanded his arrangement with them to a permanent employment agreement that included a small house on the eastern edge of the property, which was fair and which the two men were pleased with. Thomas, the young hand whom Myrtle had been teaching to read, had by the end of 1884 graduated from letters to sentences and was making his way through a natural history of the Colorado Territory with a concentration that Myrtle found deeply satisfying. In the spring of 1885, Edgar's father came west for the first time. He was an older man, William Crawford, tall and spare in the Virginia manner, and he arrived at the Pueblo train station in April with a traveling trunk and the slightly bewildered expression of a man encountering the western landscape for the first time after a lifetime of imagining it. Edgar met him at the station and drove him out to Calder County in the spring light, and William Crawford looked out at the mountains and the valley and the creek, and was quiet in the way of someone being genuinely affected by something they had not expected. He met Myrtle at the house, and she gave him her hand and looked at him with those clear eyes and said, "Mr. Crawford, Edgar has told me a great deal about you," which was somewhat more true than it was, and William Crawford looked at his daughter-in-law and then at his son with an expression that suggested he was revising some of his concerns about how Edgar had been managing his life out here. William stayed for 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks he was taken on a full survey of the Double C by Hank Delaney, who treated him with the particular respectful directness he reserved for people who had earned respect rather than just occupied it. He sat at the dinner table in the main house and listened to Edgar and Myrtle discuss the ranch operation and the Keene property and the upcoming summer rotation with the focused attention of a man who has spent a lifetime managing things and recognizes good management when he encounters it. And he held his grandson Thomas William in the garden on a warm April afternoon, while Myrtle worked in the kitchen garden 20 feet away, and told the infant, in a quiet voice, that he was a very lucky young man, which Thomas William appeared to accept as established fact. When William Crawford left on the train back to Virginia, he embraced Edgar on the Pueblo platform with a formality that was his way of expressing what he could not easily say directly, and he said, "She is remarkable." Edgar said, "Yes," and William said, "You were very lucky, Edgar," and Edgar said, "I know. I am aware of it every day." And that was the most honest exchange they had ever had, and it was enough. Life on the Double C and the Keene property in the years that followed was not without its difficulties, because no life on working land in the Colorado Territory in the 1880s was without difficulty. But the difficulties were navigated with the combined intelligence and fairness that had become the characteristic way of doing things in that particular operation. The dry year of 1886 was managed because they had learned from 1884 and had already built the contingency grazing plan into the annual rotation. The hard winter of 1887 was managed because Edgar had expanded the barn storage capacity in 1885, based on a suggestion from Myrtle that he had initially thought was overcautious, and had turned out to be exactly right. The ongoing negotiations with the railroad company, which wanted an easement of its own through the southern end of the valley, were handled by Edgar and Myrtle together, with the result that the railroad got its easement, and the valley ranchers got a water usage guarantee written into the agreement that the railroad company had not offered voluntarily. Hank Delaney, in the fall of 1886, told Edgar that he had been thinking about the property adjacent to the Double C's northwest corner, a small piece that had come available, and that he had saved enough to make an offer on it if Edgar would consider releasing him from the foreman position to establish his own operation. Edgar looked at him for a long moment, this man who had worked the Double C for 15 years and who had, by not delivering a message one afternoon in October of 1882, changed the course of Edgar's entire life. He said, "Hank, I would be glad to release you from the foreman position. I would be even gladder to be your neighbor. And I believe you should know that if you need anything in the first year, anything at all, you only have to ask." Hank bought his property in November of 1886, and Edgar helped him with the first fence line, and Myrtle organized a working party from the neighboring ranches that got the barn framed in 2 weekends, which was the way such things were done in that valley among people who had decided to be neighbors in the fullest sense of the word. Thomas William Crawford, growing up between the 2 properties, learning the creek and the cattle and the kitchen garden with equal enthusiasm, was by the age of 3 a child who had a wide acquaintance with everyone who worked on or near his family's land, and who appeared to be conducting an ongoing study of all of it that he intended to compile at some future date into a comprehensive report. Myrtle watched him follow Luis Vega around the irrigation channels with a small stick he used to point at things, and said to Edgar that she believed Thomas William was going to manage something eventually, if not everything. Edgar said, "He gets that from you," she said, "the pointing stick." He said, "The intention to understand how everything works and then improve it." She laughed, the full warm laugh that he still found as interesting as the first time he had heard it, in the kitchen of her house on a cold November afternoon when they were discussing survey documents. Their second child, a daughter this time, arrived in the summer of 1887 with the same announcement of intent that her brother had made. They named her Eleanor Rose Crawford, Eleanor for Myrtle's aunt in St. Louis, who had been somewhat warmer since the marriage and who had visited the previous spring with an adjustment of manner that suggested she had revised her assessment of Myrtle's circumstances. Eleanor Rose arrived with red in her hair, which surprised both of them and delighted everyone else, and she was from the beginning a child of strong opinions delivered through expression rather than volume, which was something entirely her own. In October of 1887, exactly 5 years after Hank Delaney had ridden back to the Double C and said that he could not do it, Myrtle and Edgar sat on the porch of the Keene house in the late afternoon light, which was the best light of the day at that time of year, golden and long and full of the specific quality that had made her dream about this valley from St. Louis. Thomas William was at the creek with Louis's nephew, who was visiting for the month and was Thomas William's current favorite person in the world. Eleanor Rose was asleep inside, making the particular sound of a sleeping baby who is completely satisfied with the state of things. Edgar was looking at the creek, at the cottonwoods along its edge, at the apple trees in the side yard which were bearing their 3rd full harvest now, loaded with fruit that would last them through the winter. He was thinking about the October 5 years ago when he had stood on the Double C porch and watched Hank ride back through the gate walking his horse slowly with his hat on, and had felt the first prick of something going wrong with his plan. He said, "I have been thinking about that afternoon in October." "Which one?" Myrtle asked, though she knew. "The one when Hank came back and said he could not do it." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the same view. Then she said, "I have thought about it too." "What would have happened if he had?" "You would have gone back to Pueblo," Edgar said. "Eventually I would have found a different lawyer and sorted out the grazing matter legitimately," she said, "and then you would have had to find a different approach." "I wonder if I would have found the right one," he said honestly. She considered this. "You might have," she said. "Eventually. You were already looking for it, I think, even when you didn't know it." She paused. "But it would have taken longer, and he saved us the time." Edgar looked at her, sitting in the late afternoon light with her dark hair loosened from its daytime arrangement and her hands quiet in her lap and the warmth of the last 5 years in her face, the particularity of a person who has been deeply known and has deeply known someone in return. He said, "I should go and find a way to properly thank him." "He's been your neighbor for a year," she said. "How have you not managed it yet? Because every time I think about what to say it seems inadequate." She looked at him with those clear eyes. "Edgar, he is not a man who needs a speech. He needs to know that you know what he did, that's all." He rode to Hank's property the following Saturday morning, with 2 bottles of very good whiskey from the Double C cellar, and a document that he had had Gerald Maston prepare the previous week, which was a formal easement of right-of-way across the Double C's northern pasture to the creek, giving Hank's small operation the same water access in dry years that the Keene easement had originally been designed to secure. He presented both items at Hank's kitchen door, and Hank looked at the whiskey and the document with the careful attention of a man reading a situation rather than just its surface. "The whiskey is gratitude," Edgar said. "The document is what you should have had 3 years ago when you established up here. I should have offered it then." Hank took both. He said, "You didn't have to." "No," Edgar said, "but I wanted to, and Myrtle told me I was overdue." Hank's expression moved. He said, "How is she?" "She is," Edgar said, looking for the right word, "extraordinary, every day. She is extraordinary every single day, and I am not sure I entirely deserve it." Hank said, "You don't." And then, with the precise timing of a man who has earned the right to say what he means, "But you're learning." They had the whiskey together on Hank's porch in the morning light, looking out at the northwest corner of the valley, and they talked about the cattle market and the coming winter and the condition of the road from town, and all of it was the ordinary talk of neighbors who know each other well, which was what they were, which was what they had become through the strange and roundabout way that things become what they are. In the years that followed, the Double C and the Keene property established themselves as the kind of operation that set the standard in Calder County for how land could be managed fairly and well and sustainably, which was a word that Myrtle had started using before most people in the territory had the framework for what it described. She wrote an account of the kitchen gardens management and the fruit tree cultivation that was published in a Colorado agricultural journal in 1889, the first piece she had published, and which brought 3 letters from women in other parts of the territory asking questions she answered in full. Edgar read the piece with pride that was entirely genuine and entirely unpretentious, the pride of someone who has watched a person they love do something they are excellent at. Thomas William Crawford, by the age of 7, had taken over the management of the creekside observation that his mother had begun when she arrived at the property, keeping a daily log in a notebook that Myrtle had given him for his birthday, and which she reviewed with him every Sunday morning. His observations were detailed and occasionally poetic in the way of a child who takes the world seriously, and Myrtle kept every notebook in a row on the shelf in the parlor, where the watercolor heron still stood on the mantelpiece. Alina Rose, at 5, was conducting her own investigation into the behavior of the apple trees, and had strong opinions about which variety was superior that she delivered to anyone who came near the side yard. She looked like Myrtle and had Edgar's precision about things that interested her, and she was already the most persuasive person in the immediate family, which was a considerable achievement given her competition. In the spring of 1890, Myrtle told Edgar that a 3rd child was on its way, which was news they received with the particular happiness of people who are not surprised to find their life continuing to expand in good directions. He held her in the kitchen in the morning by the window that looked out at the creek, and the creek was running high with snowmelt in the clear spring light, and he said into her hair, "I am so grateful that Hank could not do it." She laughed against his shoulder. "So am I," she said, "every single day." The 3rd child, another son, arrived in October of 1890, 8 years to the month after Myrtle had stood at the gate of her father's property with 2 trunks and a traveling bag, and looked at Hank Delaney with those clear eyes and said, "Welcome home." They named him Henry, which was Hank's given name, and Hank, when told, was quiet for a long moment, and then said that was a fine name, which meant considerably more than the words conveyed. Henry Crawford arrived in the world with his father's gray eyes, and his mother's chin, and the general intention, common to all the Crawford children, of understanding everything that was happening around him as completely as possible from the earliest available moment. The valley along Willow Creek held them all through the years that followed, through the good summers and the difficult winters, through the negotiations and the growing and the ordinary daily work of people who have decided to make their lives in a particular place and with a particular person. The water easement was renewed and updated as the operations evolved. The apple trees grew into a small orchard, 7 trees by 1892, the fruit enough to supply both households and to send a quantity to Hank's place each fall. Thomas Williams Creek notebooks filled a second shelf and began filling a third. Alina Rose developed her opinions about the apple trees to a level of specificity that would eventually, in later years, inform a genuine understanding of horticulture. Henry learned to talk at an age that surprised everyone except his mother, who said she had expected it, and said things with the particular deliberateness of a child who had been listening to careful conversation his entire short life. Edgar Crawford, riding the Double C on a September morning in 1892, was 43 years old and the owner of a ranch that ran 4,000 acres and employed 22 hands and was known throughout southeastern Colorado for the quality of its cattle and the fairness of its management, both of which were accurate assessments. He was also the husband of Myrtle Keene Crawford, which was the thing that organized everything else and gave it its meaning, and he was aware of this in the precise and continuous way that matters most, not as a background fact but as a present one, always current, always relevant. He was riding past the eastern boundary of his land, where it met the Keene property, when he saw her at the creek. She was standing at the bank where the water ran shallower over the pale stones, and she had her boots off and her feet in the water in the October cold, which was an extremely her thing to do, and she was looking at the water with the expression he had first seen in October of 1882 from across a kitchen garden, that expression of recognition, of being exactly where one belongs. He dismounted and tied Atlas and walked down to the bank, and she heard him coming and turned, and 10 years had not changed the way she looked at him when she turned and saw him, that quick warm thing moving through her eyes, the full presence of it. "Feet in the water in October," he said. "The water is still clear," she said. "Come and feel it." "Absolutely not," he said, and sat on the bank beside her and took off his boots. The creek was cold enough to take the breath, cold and clear and fast over the pale stones, and it sounded exactly as it had always sounded, as it had sounded on the nights she lay awake in St. Louis and dreamed herself back here, as it had sounded on the night she arrived with her trunks and her traveling bag and her deed, as it had sounded on all the nights since, running through the valley and past the apple trees and along the boundary of 2 properties that had become, in every way that mattered, one life. They sat on the bank of the creek on a September afternoon in 1892 with their feet in the cold water, and the cottonwoods made their sound in the light wind, and somewhere up the bank Thomas William was throwing stones into the deep pool he had been studying since he could walk, and the ranch was there, and the house was there, and everything that had been built and grown and tended was there, and none of it had happened the way Edgar had planned, and all of it was better than anything he would have planned. And he knew precisely whose doing that was. He reached over and took her hand, which was warm from the sun, and she laced her fingers through his with the ease of someone who has done this so many times it has become its own kind of home, and they sat there in the afternoon and listened to the creek, and the creek ran on as it always did, clear and cold, and saying the things that only water knows how to say, the things that do not need words. the things that Myrtle had heard from 2,000 miles away in the dark of a St. Louis winter, and had followed back to this valley and this man and this life. And that was the whole of it, and it was more than enough, and it was exactly right.